the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Let us pray. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Ghost, that we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. Catherine of Stenning, pray for us. St. Wilfrid of York, pray for us. St. Richard of Chichester, pray for us. St. Rowena of Alfriston, pray for us. St. Lawrence of Rome, pray for us. Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Right, well, good morning everyone, and welcome to session 5 in our series on vocational discernment. So this week we'll start to look at the how of vocational discernment. So for the last 4 weeks, I suppose really we've talked about what it is, the necessity of it, and broadly how it works. But this week we might we'll start to think about some of the foundations necessary to begin to employ the various tools and exercises that have been developed over the centuries. Now, key always, so remembering that the whole point, the whole purpose is to discern God's will, not to affirm our own, and not necessarily to affirm our idea of what God's will is for us. And the whole purpose is to truly try and seek His will. Key then is preparation. And as we said before, knowing yourself. Now, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola always begin with self-examination, because of this basic principle that in order to really properly discern God's will for us, in other words, to identify, to work out what His purpose is for us as an individual, remembering that we know God's general purpose for everyone is to be saved, for everyone to know Him, to love Him, to serve Him, and to be fulfilled in this life and in the next. But in order to discern His will, His particular will for the individual, we need to know ourselves. And so there's a kind of two-step process in terms of preparing. Now again, here really I'm talking about discernment of God in the present time, then God in the present moment. So remember, God in the present moment is being open to and discerning what God's immediate will is in an immediate situation. But as I said before, we need to periodically take time out in order to reflect with hindsight and see if there is any trend, or if there is anything, if there is a key, or if there is anything discernible with hindsight, looking over present moments to see if God's will for us is being made known or made clear to us. So I suppose this week really is about signs and pointers. How do we recognise signs and pointers? But as I said, we need periodically to take time out. So we need to prepare ourselves for this time out, because this time out really is taking time out. There's no sort of half measure. Well, you can do it half measure, but you'll only get, you won't get anything out of it. So you really do need to take, to set aside a period of time. And as I said before, often too, it's useful to take oneself out completely of one's day-to-day situation. So literally change one's environment, and literally block out a period of time. The most common way for people to do this today, of course, is to book, say, a half-day retreat. And if you do that, so if you contact a retreat centre, or if you a convent or a monastery, when you do that, you want to be clear that you don't want a guided retreat, unless you do want a guided retreat. But if you have a guided retreat, then of course you will be the spiritual director is likely to give you things to think about, which to some extent is fine, but is better if you're really honing what you've already discerned may be God's will. So the best way to use a spiritual director is, after a period of self-reflection and discernment, then to go and externalise that to somebody else, as it were, for a check and for a balance, and maybe for assistance in order to more deeply or further fill out what you've already discerned for yourself, or what's come to you. But before that, to begin really is to take time out for oneself, by oneself. And retreat centres and monastic houses are very welcoming to silent retreatants, or to people who don't want a guided retreat. It's easy for them because they can just, they don't have to do anything. But they will provide a room or space or hospitality and they will, help to facilitate it in the practical senses. And you don't have to go to a retreat centre or a monastery. First instance, again, you don't want to do too much. Really, the whole point is to be still. So anywhere really where you can be still and not be distracted is important. And then in preparation, as I said, there's sort of two things to consider with regard to knowing oneself. There's self-examination of conscience, and there is identifying one's skills and abilities and predispositions, recognizing them. So self-examination of conscience, the purpose for that really is to judge, as it were, your relationship with God. So self-examination of conscience is, of course, about looking at one's weaknesses, looking at one's faults and failings. Now, I will say that most of us can be quite harsh self-critics. Some people aren't, but many of us can be too harsh upon ourselves. And we have to remember, perhaps, that the purpose, that in the context of vocational discernment, self-examination of conscience is not preparation for confession. You may realise that you need to go to confession afterwards, but the purpose is not really to necessarily identify particular sins or to remember particular sins. The idea really is to recognise one's faults and one's failings and one's weaknesses. So to consider, what is there, what do I regularly foul up on in terms of keeping God's commandments? So in terms of loving Him and loving others, what do I find most difficult? And that can cover, a multitude of variances, from, what is my attitude like about going to church or about going to Mass, or what is my attitude like during Mass, or other forms of worship? What is my prayer life like? What is my attitude and my approach to prayer? Do I find it difficult? And when I find it difficult, what is it that's difficult about it? In my relationships and interactions with others, what is it that I find difficult in interacting with others? Now again, your mind may think of particular instances or of particular individuals, but in many ways you don't want to focus on a particular interaction with an individual. You want to focus more on on your attitude and approach, and see if it is a constant thing. Unless, of course, unless you're almost a saint, but there is just this one particular individual that you just cannot get on with, then focus on that. But otherwise, try not, as it were, to allow yourself to become, to digress or be distracted by thoughts of a single instance, but rather try to look at attitudes, approaches, characteristics, in general terms. And the reason for that, of course, is that you can really what we're doing in this process is identifying strengths and weaknesses. So in considering your skills, your talents, your abilities, the things that you are good at, or the things that you're inclined to, that you're predisposed to, those are your strengths. And then your faults, your failings, those are your weaknesses, or the things you find difficult to handle, those are your weaknesses. And from that process, you should be able to know more about yourself and recognise areas of your life that may need development, but also too, you may identify aspects of your life that may be a clear signal as to what God intends you to do. By which I mean, for example, as we've said before, people can be predisposed towards music, or towards math or science, or literature, or cooking, or whatever. These things can be practical, or not. So that if one is inclined towards study, academia, that might suggest that perhaps God's will is for you to play a role in increasing knowledge and wisdom. For others, or if you're more practical, it may be that God wants you to employ those practical gifts in His service. So if you're a musician, that He might want you to discover ways in which you can employ your music in proclaiming the gospel or in servicing worship. There are all sorts of, it's all horses for courses. It all really does depend on the strengths and weaknesses of an individual. And as I say, the point of the exercise is not to beat oneself up, but the point of the exercise is simply to understand yourself better. And often you will realise things about yourself that you haven't noticed before. both positives and negatives, pros and cons. And whilst you're examining yourself in this way, there are all sorts of questions that you can ask yourself. And this is where things like the spiritual exercises, the Ignatian spiritual exercises, and others can provide prompts, can provide key questions or key words that may be useful to help you. But as I said before, you could always begin analysis with to know, to love, to serve, and to be fulfilled. So you can ask yourself, when, for example, thinking about your weaknesses, you might ask yourself, well, or to identify your weaknesses, you may ask yourself, what prevents me from knowing God? What prevents me from loving Him? What prevents me from serving Him? What prevents me from feeling fulfilled with God? Likewise, in analysing one's strengths, again, you can ask yourself about this particular aspect. How does this enable me to know God? Or how could it enable me to know God better? Or how could it enable me to assist others to know God? And that's the other key thing, is that, as we said before, it's always in and out, so that whatever it is you'll be called to do, whatever it is God is calling you to do, it is never selfish. It's never for its own end. It will always be in some way to serve Him. And that may be through serving others, or it may be by providing something that others can use in order to serve Him, but it will never be. It'll never be about self. And I think this is one of the things that's such an important contrast between vocational discernment and other forms of contemplation and meditation, or ways of understanding oneself. Because in vocational discernment, it's always about the ultimate point of the exercise is, how can I serve God? So it's always going to be taking your thoughts, from within to without. And this, of course, reflects what our Lord Himself so often says: if anyone would be a disciple of mine, he must deny himself. And this, of course, is in radical contrast to so much of the contemporary zeitgeist, which is all about me, myself, and I, and which is all about self-identity. Again, with vocational discernment, although we're looking at ourselves, we're trying to see our identity within God, with and for God. It's recognizing that we are a child of God, we were purposed by God, that our life is not our own, our life is a gift from God, and He has purposely given us this gift to achieve something for His will. So with Christian vocational discernment, it's always going to be about externalizing. Although we are, in order to be able to externalize, we are interiorly reflecting. The whole point is for it to come out. Why? Because true love, true charity, the divine charity, sacrificial love is all about giving. It's all about self-sacrifice. It's not self-serving. It's to serve others, to serve God. in order to fulfill God's will, we will fulfill the summary of the law, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and the second, to love your neighbour. It's fundamentally, it is all about love, but true love, meaning sacrificial love, a love that is not for itself, a love that is disinterested almost in self. And the purpose of that is because that is the way in which love grows. That is the way in which others can be reached and touched by God's love, and how then both our individual and our collective expression in vocation fulfills God's will for humanity. God desires everyone to know him, to love him, to serve him, and to be happy with him in this life and in the next. So that individual vocational discernment is not about self-identity. Not about self-identity. It's not about me, myself, and I. It's really, what is my identity in and before and through and with God? But in order to do that, you have to begin by knowing that you are in God, that you are, by acknowledging yourself as a child of God. So again, with that in mind, this is why for vocational discernment, it's important not to get bogged down, as it were, with the preoccupation of oneself. And because ultimately, our true identity is nothing without God. It's kind of all or nothing. Orlando Bloom, his character in a film called The Kingdom of Heaven, he plays a chap called Belial, who ends up defending Jerusalem against the Saracens. But they're sort of besieged and they're losing. And basically Belial goes out to surrender to Saladin. And at the end of their conversation, where they've agreed terms, Saladin has said, you can leave Jerusalem peacefully, and you can go to the coast, and etc. And we won't attack you, blah blah blah. And Belial says to Saladin, he says, "What is Jerusalem worth?" And Saladin says, "Nothing," and turns away, takes 2 paces, turns back and says, "And everything." And likewise, who we are, as it were, in God is nothing and everything and nothing. Now remembering, those mortal words of St. John the Baptist, "I must decrease that he may increase," referring to Christ, and of course from Paul, who says, "It is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me." Ultimately, because to achieve full union with God is, as it were, to be happy to sacrifice any possessiveness about oneself in order to become one with God. Because, there's the verse, I think it's Proverbs, who is man that thou art mindful of him? Who is any individual then before God? No one is equal to God, no one is his is in relationship with God. Take away God from the equation and we are lost. And we see this in our society. We are effectively living now in a godless society. It was a term or a phrase that used to be used to imagine a society that was without purpose, that had no morality. Well, frankly, now we're living in such a society, a godless society, where morality has been completely relativized and subjectivized, so there is no more objective standard that people are striving to live their lives by. Some are. There is still some remnant of Judeo-Christian ethic in our legal system, but the ethos of our society is wholly about personal interest. It's all about me, myself and I, and everything is now relative to me, myself and I, as to whether or not I accord it any respect or any consideration, as to whether or not I allow it to impede or contain my behaviour. Just last week in the news locally there was a piece about kids running amok in a McDonald's in Western Road, and I think last month there was a similar thing about kids doing the same in an Asda store, cycling through the store and causing general chaos and commotion. And of course, in one respect, what can be done about that? What can be done about that? If anyone intervenes, what can they do to intervene? Apart from verbal intervention, what else can you do? If you attempt physically to intervene, you're more than likely going to be charged with some form of assault. And even a verbal interaction might be classed as an assault. Because we're not allowed today to insult people, we're not allowed today to mock people, we're not allowed today to point out the faults and failings and weaknesses in others, etc., etc. It's like we've become a bizarre society where, on the one hand, there are supposedly high ideals, but on the other hand, nobody's forced to use them. With the case of children running amok, now of course, wisdom of the ages and of the sages says, spare the rod and spoil the child. Now, that's not to say necessarily that capital punishment is the only way to bring children up, but clearly these youngsters are behaving in the way they are because they do not fear any kind of reprisal or any kind of consequence to their actions. They're not worried about being arrested by the police. They're not worried about being detained by security staff. They're not worried about being physically prevented by anyone, because they know that they can just turn around and claim the kind of victim scenario about it all. If you to ask yourself, imagine yourself in either of those situations, what would you do, or what could you do? This is, the problem with an amoral society. Now, I hope that we as individuals would probably, say, well, I'd want to remonstrate with them. I'd want to say, why are you doing this? This is hurting other people. This is, no good for you, etc., etc. But you kind of, but if their response is, so what? So what? So what? So what? only way, for example, we can affect the prevention of those sorts of similar situations arising in the future is by ourselves trying to assert a greater influence upon society around us, and the communities around us. As I've said before, if every Christian, so-called Christian, behaved in a Christ-like way all the time, however small or few in number there may be, they would have an impact. They would have a significant impact. They would gradually be able, people would look and say, oh, actually that seems a better way of being. And it would affect change. We see this in the early church, that it was the fellowship that the Christians had for one another, it was the charity that they showed to one another that drew people and encouraged others, and encouraged their curiosity, because Christians behaved, they were nice to each other, and they were nice to others, they were nice to strangers, they were nice to the poor, they were nice to the sick. They went out of their way to help other people, and they did it joyfully, they did it non-begrudgingly. So we heard in the readings today from St. Paul, God loves a cheerful giver. But how many Christians are really cheerful givers when it comes to putting money in the collection plate, or tithing, or being asked in the street by a beggar or for money? Are we always cheerful givers, or are we really possessive and judgmental? Judgmentalism often in that regard comes from basically wanting not to give. So that you'll say, you'll look at someone and you'll sort of weigh up what they're going to do with whatever it is they've asked for. Now, there is something to be said for the exercise of prudence. If a beggar is asking for wine or booze, it's probably not a good idea to give them wine or booze. And it's probably, and giving them money may, of course, not ultimately necessarily be the best thing to do, as they may be collecting the money, as they often are, to then go and buy whatever it is that they think makes their lives better or more bearable, whether it's drugs or smokes or booze. But in one sense, there's something about having to let people decide for themselves, or take responsibility for their actions. So it's a constant debate in amongst circles involved with looking with when they see, I want to say, supporting the homeless, and yet what are we doing by supporting the homeless? So there are some suggest, aren't we just enabling them to continue to be homeless? If we're always providing them food, if we're always providing them clean clothing, if we're always providing them occasional shelter, are we not just, but we're not enabling them to get proper help, or not enabling them to get jobs, or whatever. What is it we're doing? But ultimately, we do have to, as much as we need to serve others, and we need to be selfless in our giving and not selfish. Sometimes it's to remember that, well, okay, if I give money, they may well go off and do whatever with it, but that's up to them. That's up to them. The point is, in that present moment, however, you were answering a need. You were able to give something that somebody needed. But sometimes your giving may prompt them to think, oh, well, no, maybe I shouldn't go and do what I was originally going to do with this money. Maybe I should go and get something to eat instead. Who knows? Anyway, I'm digressing wildly. What was I? Serving others, yes. So whatever one's particular vocation in life is, whatever it is that God is calling you to do as an individual, whatever his purpose is for you as an individual, it will always be disinterested self. Like I said, not complete disinterest in self, but it will be about selflessness, it will be about sacrifice, it will be about giving, because it is all about generating love. That's the whole point of the gospel, that's the whole point of our faith, that's the whole point of God. God is love, and they who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And so always his purpose will be about sharing his love. So that's the sort of thing to hold in mind when performing this self-analysis. Is always to think, how will this enable me to serve God? How will this enable me to generate and perpetuate charity towards others? And this is why true vocational discernment in this sense, of course, is about disinterest, in the sense that it's not about, how can I make money from this? How can I better improve my situation, my circumstances materially for myself? We hear sometimes how people have become homeless. You can realise sometimes how in your own life you've been on a knife edge or can be on that knife edge. So true vocational discernment is never going to be about necessarily career progression with a view to material or comfortable things. It's always going to be about service. So self-examination, strengths and weaknesses, and then spiritual reading. Now, as I said last week, spiritual reading is not the same as contemplation and meditation for vocational discernment. It may feed into it, because obviously we receive wisdom and knowledge hopefully from what we're reading. We may gain insight or even guidance, but so ahead of one's time out for vocational reflection, one might engage in some spiritual reading. And there are innumerable things one can read, but some that have particularly stood the test of time. One, for example, from our own old Roman Catholic tradition, that is from Holland, going back to the 16th century, the Brotherhood of the Common Life, which in many ways was trying to create, rather like this mission here, a community of Christians like that in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament. And from that came various insights, and these were recorded by St. Thomas à Kempis, and he collected them into a book called The Imitation of Christ. And you'll notice in this book, as with some others I'll mention, it all seems to be in a kind of dialogue. It's all presented as a kind of question and answer, often question, answer, meditation and prayer. So the Imitation of Christ is one book to read. Another one is An Introduction to a Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. And again, that is presented in a dialogue, a sort of question and answer. Now with both these examples, the questions and answers, you will notice that sometimes the question is to yourself, sometimes the question is from yourself to God. Sometimes the answer is a suggested answer from God, sometimes it's a suggested answer from yourself to God. And normally the suggested answer from yourself to God is an aspirational answer. So it's reminding you of, from the gospel precepts, what your attitude or your approach should be in answering this particular suggested question from God to oneself. Similarly, the spiritual exercises by Ignatius also have a similar structure, in that they don't necessarily provide written questions and answers, but the stages of the spiritual exercises suggest questioning, suggest ways in which to question oneself and to question God. So we see here, again, that the whole purpose of this is developing one's relationship with God. Like I said last week, the first duty of the Christian is worship. The first duty of the Christian is to have a relationship with God. And the only way you can have a relationship with someone is to get to know them. The only way to get to know them is by having a conversation with them, is by having a dialogue with them. Now, as we said before, the tricky part for us is that having a conversation with God is not always as easy as having a conversation with one of us. You don't always get an immediate answer. But in many ways, a lot of the questions we have are already answered. They're already answered by divine revelation. They're already answered by the teachings of Jesus. They're already answered by the lives of the saints. And this is why spiritual reading in this way is so relevant, because in many ways, well, as Proverbs says, there's nothing new under the sun. You see again how the idea of self or self-interest is just totally irrelevant. There's nothing new under the sun, which is not to say, which is not to belittle one's uniqueness before God, because one is unique before God. But at the same time, one is nothing without Him, and that has been true throughout the ages. And often in spiritual, why often I commend reading the lives of the saints, because in reading the lives of the saints, you see how other human beings were able to do extraordinary things because of the manifestation of their love for God, because of the way they trusted Him in difficult situations, and because they were ordinary people like us. I always say, you can find a saint if you research enough. You will find a saint whose life will, in many respects, marry your own, or remind you of your own, either in the sense of strengths or in weaknesses. I took Jerome as a patron because I recognised aspirational strengths in him that I desired for myself, that I thought I had a predisposition towards as well, like study, theology, scripture, knowledge of the scriptures. But at the same time, we also recognised that I had similar weaknesses to him, so that I could be stubborn, I could be rude, I could be irascible, I could be tetchy, but nonetheless, he became a saint. He's recognised as a saint. And why is he recognised as a saint? Not because he achieved perfection in this life, but because he was striving continually for perfection despite his failings. And I think that's, again, key to understanding the saints, is that we're not saying that the saints were perfect in this life, because that's not true at all. Perfection will not be achieved in this life. The perfection of the wholeness of creation and the harmony and the balance between divine and creature will not be realised in this life. That will come when the kingdom comes, the new heaven, new earth, etc. What's key about the saints now is, what's key about our understanding of the saints is that they strove, despite their faults and failings. They were striving for perfection. And we believe that it is, because of that striving that they achieved heaven. And our kind of proofs of their having achieved heaven is often, the answers to prayers, is the efficacy of their intercession on our behalf. So the miracles, etc., that have been attributed to them, not just when they were alive, but also when they had died, signifying that their striving in this life had enabled them to achieve a level of sanctity to get into the next. So that often in the lives of the saints, we can find inspiration, or we can simply, as we're reading the lives of the saints, we can, some of their lives may not speak to us, but even so, just by reading their lives will inform us that, it's horses for courses, that different people go through different things. People have to deal with different things in order to pursue and to fulfill God's vocation for their life. And ultimately the test, of course, of the validity of their vocation is in what they were able to accomplish for others. And often the key thing with the saints is that they were able to inspire faith in others. They were able to inspire and to generate charity in others. They were able to encourage others to strive for holiness and perfection. Which is ultimately what, any one of us ought to be about ourselves. So, the first step, or the first steps in preparing for discernment, vocational discernment, are self-examination, understanding oneself in relation as being in a relationship with God, understanding one's strengths and one's weaknesses, identifying strengths, identifying weaknesses, and all the time considering how can I serve God? How can I overcome my weaknesses? How do they prevent me from knowing, loving and serving God and being fulfilled? And equally with my strengths, and my strengths are, how can they enable me and others to know, love, serve spiritual reading, as I say, the lives of the saints, an introduction to a devout life, Francis de Sales, the Imitation of Christ, Thomas à Kempis. And these are not difficult reads. It depends on the edition sometimes. The originals, they were quite wordy in the 15th and 16th centuries. It's not reading that necessarily trips off the tongue, as it were, if you were to read it out loud, because sometimes their idioms and their phrases are a bit old-fashioned. But then that's no trouble. That's no problem in itself, because actually it should encourage you to strive harder to understand what it is they're trying to say. But in both instances, they were written for ordinary people. They weren't written for theologians. They weren't written for monks and nuns and they were written for ordinary people. So I encourage you to search those out. You can find them online. You can find them in print. You can find them in second-hand bookshops. You can find them anywhere. But use those to prepare for when you're going to take that time out. So this self-examination process, again, is something to use to prepare for time out, but also will be some of what you do in time out. And spiritual reading is a preparation for time out, not to do in time out. Remembering that in time out, what we want to try and do is clear our thoughts as much as possible, because that time out really is about waiting for an answer, is about allowing, is about being open to receiving an answer from God. So we'll leave it there this week, again next week I'll give examples from the spiritual exercises of Ignatius and various others, so that we can look at them and ask ourselves, how to utilize them with everything that I've said today. Okay. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.